We're excited today to introduce Doris McCraw, and she is a speaker, an author, and a historian specializing in women's history. She's also a member of the Pikes Peak Posse of the Westerners. She's going to present a program today called Under the Stone, Early Women Doctors in Evergreen Cemetery. She's a student of history, the stories of people who preceded us, and she has a passion since her childhood in West Central Illinois. Once she ran the obituary of Julia Loomis, she never looked back. She's been working to tell the stories of the medical school and licensed women who made Colorado their home, even for a brief time. So please join me in welcoming Doris McCraw.
The lovely thing about being down here is the applause sounds like 10 million people. Can you all hear me? Okay. Before I start talking about the women themselves, I want to give you a little background. Because the medicine that these women and men practice is not what we know of as medicine today. In the 1800s, there were 3 modalities that were the most popular. The primary one was homeopathy, which is very similar to what we know today. The other one was allopathy, or being an allopath, which is what we would call regular doctors today. Homeopathy had the concept that like could cure like. So the idea was if you had a cold or an allergy, they would give you something that was similar to that so that your body could fight it off, would learn that immunity. An allopath used what was outside the body. And at that time, think leeches, bleeding, that was the thought going into the 1800s, because that's what they'd been doing in the 1700s. And then in 1874, osteopathy came into being, and their concept was that everything that was wrong with the body was due to the skeleton, that's where it all started, which sounds a little bit like chiropractic to me, but
that's good.
That's what they called it then. So, and then in the United States, around the 1890s, a new modality came out called eclectic medicine. And that was the idea that you used what was around you to try to cure what was going on. Think of native and indigenous peoples, what they would use to heal people. And so if the waters could have been called an eclectic type of medicine, because you're using what is in a region. I'm giving that a very broad definition. So we're looking at that. Of the first 4 women doctors in this region, 3 of them were homeopaths. And the one that got me started was Julia Loomis. I ran across her obituary in the local paper, and I was down in special collections at the Penrose Library, and I said, "Who is this person? Have you heard of her?" "No." You don't tell me no. So I said, okay. So I started researching Julia. So I will start with her, but at the same time, Harriet Leonard, who was in Manitou Springs, working at the same time. They basically arrived here almost simultaneously. Both families say that they were here in 1876. I can document for sure that they were here by 1878. They were not the first in Colorado. The first medical school graduate, and that is my cutoff for looking at these women doctors. Either they had to have graduated from a medical college, or they had to have been licensed by the state of Colorado, which began in 1881. And I will say this for Colorado, In 1881, it did not matter whether you were a man or a woman. If you had the qualifications, you could be licensed by the state. The first one to arrive was in 1873, the first female. Her name was Eliza Gillette. She graduated from a school in Ohio. She only remained in Colorado for about 3 years, and then she went off, and I sort of lost where she ended up. She kept moving around. The second one was Alida Avery, who stayed here for a while. What is interesting about what brought women to this region and to Colorado is, number one, health. But in the case of Alida Avery, who came from Vassar, she was one of the first staff of Vassar. After 9 years, she came out here. She was very involved in the women's suffrage movement. And Colorado at the time was a hotbed for suffrage. But she still continued practicing medicine. In reading the information about her, when she was at Vassar those 9 years, she did not lose a single patient. She was an amazing woman. At some point, that's not what I'm here for, but to give you an idea of kind of what was bringing people, especially women, to this region. In terms of Julia and Harriet, I believe it was the health. Julia Loomis was born in 1816 in New Woodstock, New York. And then her maiden name was Frizzell. After she married John Loomis, they had 2 children while still in New York, John and Gertrude. Then the family just sort of moved around. They were in Buchanan County, Iowa in the 1860s because their son John went into the Civil War, and as was wont for the smaller communities, the soldiers would send letters back to the newspaper, and then they would print them. And John sent letters back to the Buchanan County newspaper. They stayed there. Gertrude got married. She married a man named Taylor. She died 2 years later. John's first child, Lynn, John the son's first child, died in Iowa. And then around 1876, 1878, they came to Colorado. What I found most interesting about Julia is after losing, her daughter and her grandson, she went to the Cleveland Women's Homeopathic College, where she graduated in 1871. She was in that second class. What is so impressive is she was in her 50s when she went to college to get her medical degree. I'll talk a little more about Julia later. Harriet was also born in New York around 1827, I believe I've got that date. I'm not good with dates, but I think I have that one correct. She married Leonard in Minnesota. Yeah, Minnesota. And then they came out here. Harriet did not stay here the whole time. I found her in Denver in 1877-78. Then she was back here. What I love about Harriet is she was an allopath. And she'd gone to school at the Keokuk School of Physicians and Surgeons in Keokuk, Iowa, which was right across the river from where I grew up. So I went, okay, I'm grabbing onto this one. I want to know more. This college, which became part of the University of Iowa, was a college that one of the first state colleges to go co-ed, which was prior to the 1870s. So when Harriet would have applied, they couldn't turn her away because she was a woman. But this was a co-ed school, and she was an allopath. She was one of what we would call like the doctor we have today. So I found that really interesting. Here are two women coming from New York with a few years between, who both end up here, both with different modalities. The other thing that Harriet did is she became a proprietor of a spa here, which women weren't supposed to do that, but she did anyway. And for that reason, both Harriet and Julia have fascinated me from the beginning. And Julia, her intent had been to create a consumption or tuberculosis sanitarium. Unfortunately, Julia died in 1880. So her dream didn't come true of creating that place for consumptives. Now, I do want to point out, and I double-checked this, many people equate in that time frame consumption with tuberculosis, which it was. But I have a friend who is a doctor in Scotland, and I asked him about consumption. He said, consumption in that time was not just tuberculosis, it was any wasting disease. So that could have been cancer, that could have been asthma. Any of those things would have been considered consumption back then. So when I talk about consumption, I'm also talking about other illnesses that would have fallen under that heading. The other two women who followed Harriet and Julia were Clara Rowe and Esther Holmes. Clara and Esther both graduated from the same school as Julia, but after her. And I found it very interesting that all three of them that had gone to the same college all ended up here within a year of each other. And Clara and Esther didn't know each other, and they knew Julia. Clara's husband was an insurance and real estate man. Esther's husband was a shoe salesman. What I also found very interesting is during this time frame, a lot of women thought you couldn't be married and be a doctor. But these four women proved them wrong. I mean, all four of them were married. And I think it became kind of a preference. And if you didn't have a husband to sort of support you when you were going to college, that could have been a little tricky. Esther, who married at the age of 15, she and her husband never had children. But in her time, she stayed here the whole time. Once she moved here, she stayed here. Now, Clara Rowe, once her husband passed away in the 1890s, she moved on to California. So Esther, Harriet, and Julia are all buried in Evergreen Cemetery. Esther later was disinterred and is now buried on the East Coast with her husband. It was about 5 years later. Now you may wonder, how did people know about this region? Now we know that Palmer came through here. We know that even prior to that, even the Long expedition that was here in 1820, they all were aware of the springs that were here, as were the indigenous people prior to that. But once people started moving here, the huge proponent was Edwin Solly. Dr. Solly had come from England, he and his wife, in search of a cure for, and they had tuberculosis. His wife did not survive. He did. Now, he did remarry and all of that, and Solly is actually in Evergreen Cemetery also, as is Anderson, which I'll hit on in a moment. But Solly started writing pamphlets and books talking about the benefits of the air here, the waters, and since he had come from England and Palmer had people in England, I mean, it was that natural connection. And my understanding is that when Manitou was first conceived, it was conceived, like Colorado Springs, as a resort town, a place for people to come and relax, and then the health benefits, it just sort of blossomed. And in case you're wondering, there aren't any springs in Colorado Springs, but it sounds good. There might have been one that's no longer there. Now, B.P. Anderson was the first male doctor in Colorado Springs. And at one point, Solly and Anderson actually had a practice together. Those were the first ones. They were the ones that paved the way. And there was a little, I found it in the newspaper, in the Pueblo paper of all places, where they made a mention of the fact that Harriet Leonard had lost a patient and that everybody was kind of raising all kinds of fuss. So I'm going to read to you what they wrote in their paper. Now remember, this is the 1870s, so news was a little more interesting back then, and they wrote things a little differently. There seems to be something the matter with the doctors up here, speaking of Colorado Springs, Manitou Springs. Dr. Harriet Leonard, the lady who runs a vapor bath establishment, thinks some of the other doctors have been imposing upon her. 2 or 3 articles appeared in the Avalanche that were not especially to the good lady's credit. Not the doctress, not doctor, doctress, not the doctress comes back with a letter of explanation and accounts for the death of George Thomas, one of her vapor bath patients, in a plausible manner. Vapor baths may be good for an iron constitution encased in a heavy coating of Mother Earth, but for a narrow-chested consumptives hanging on the brink of eternity, one good strong vapor bath is enough to take what little steam out of them that may exist in their flickering tenements. Regardless of, I love this little bit of Harriet. It just is like, okay, and your point is? I love that. I wish I'd have known her. Well, actually, I wish I'd have known all these women. If I could travel back in time, you know I would. So those were the first 4. Now, more followed. Frances Miller is buried in Evergreen, and she came out here in 1894. She was one of the later ones. Once she moved out here and set up her practice, a sister and 2 brothers followed her out here, and they had a boarding house on Boulder Crescent. And she practiced here for quite some time, and then about 1910, she ups and moves to Seattle, Washington. I searched and searched and searched for this woman. I finally found her running a boarding house in Seattle. Why she stopped as a doctor, I don't know. But when she, in her age, she lived to be in her 90s. She was a very long-lived lady. She actually came back here and is buried with her sister and brother in Evergreen. So some women, this was their passion, and then not anymore. One that I found incredibly fascinating was Minnie C. Coulter. Now, Minnie, as far as I can tell in my research, was born in Germany. She came here when she was like 11 or 12. So much of her early life is totally lost to records right now. I haven't been able to find her. But when she married George Coulter, she was in Atchison, Kansas. And they may have met in Davenport, Iowa, because when he passed away, they said they were sending him back to his home in Davenport, which again was across the river from where I grew up. So she and George were in Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. Yes, were there for quite some time. And she was listed as a doctor that whole time. Now, she was, according to Mary DeMond, who wrote the book, Women Physicians of Colorado, she was licensed not because she had gone to medical school, but because of her years of experience as a doctor. Because doctors could technically, until 1881, they could have studied with a doctor for a couple of years and said they were a doctor. Or they could have just said they were a doctor and nobody would know the difference. So licensing was pretty important. I will say California started licensing in 1876. And Alida Avery and Eliza Gillette were both registered in California when they arrived here. So they were okay, kind of. But Minnie, once she left Atchison, she moved around. She was in Leadville, 1894, 95. And I checked the city directory. She was the only female physician there in 1894 out of 22 men, and in 1895 out of 24 men. She arrived in Colorado Springs around 1898 is when I first found her in the city directory. And she lived here and she worked as a doctor until her death in 1902. And she had gone to Lincoln, Nebraska, and passed away there. And her, quote, obituary in the local paper said, "Funeral today. Funeral services of the late Dr. M. Coulter will take place this afternoon at 3 o'clock from the late residence, number 11 East Boulder Street. Dr. Coulter died in Omaha, and the funeral was to have taken place yesterday, but was postponed on account of the train bearing the remains being delayed." What is really sad, I went to try to find her headstone in Evergreen Cemetery. There was not any. And when I went through the records, because the death records tells you what lot and what block, I went and I still could not find anything. I finally, bless her heart, the young lady at the cemetery, I explained to her what I was trying to do. She went back into the archives, found the original lot card, and we realized that she was buried. Here's the stone of the gentleman buried there. She's here, and then there's a stone for another gentleman here. So she technically is kind of underneath the first guy's stone. And I find things like that fascinating. And if you go look at the stones of these doctors, and I'll talk about a couple more, number one, there was not one for Minnie. Esther Holmes never had one, and I could understand that because she was disinterred. But I literally had to go back to the same girl. I go, where's Esther? And so she hunted her up for me. Harriet, Frances Miller do not indicate that they were doctors. It's just their names. But Julia Loomis, who was buried in 1880, and it's her headstone that you see on the cover of the book, has her name and has MD right after it, which for me tells me that her family totally supported her in her desire to be a doctor. And they were proud of her. I mean, you could just, after I found the obituary, I went and looked for the headstone. And I read that headstone and I went, oh, it just sang to me. And then I went and found Harriet's, and it's a lovely stone. It was standard for the time that she was buried in the early 1900s. Excuse me. But I was saddened that they didn't indicate that she was a doctor, because to me, what she did was so important. And it was so important for the Minnie Coulters and the Dr. Miller. And the next one I'm going to talk about, Dr. Muir. These women, Julia, Harriet, and then Esther and Clara, paved a way for these other women to come and practice here. And I want that to be honored. I want these women to be remembered. Whether they did great things, which they did, they went to, they became doctors, but they followed their passion and they did what they could to ease the suffering of the people that they were treating. Now, like Esther, basically in her years here in Colorado Springs, became known as the baby doctor, because that was the thing that she did. She delivered most of the babies. What was really interesting is when I looked at the death records for Julia Loomis, it was Esther Holmes who signed the death certificate. Actually, it's E.B. Holmes, but that's Esther, and it was her handwriting. I mean, I totally recognized it. Now, Hannah Taylor Muir was the second doctor at Colorado College, second female doctor at Colorado College, the first being Grace Preston, who was only there for about a year. And Grace died shortly thereafter of tuberculosis, unfortunately. But Dr. Muir was also an amazing woman. She graduated from the Women's Medical College in Pennsylvania in 1890. She was the clinical obstetrician at the University of Colorado from 93 to 95. She also was the assistant county physician of Arapahoe County of Colorado between 93 and 94. She took postgraduate courses in New York, in Vienna, and in Philadelphia. It seems that she was very, very well liked by her students. And her husband, I gather they'd had a practice together. He was from, excuse me, he had been born in India and immigrated in 79, and I believe he was of Scottish descent. But she was attending these world-famous institutions to continue her education. Now, this was in the 1890s, so we're talking about 20 years after Harriet and Julia had arrived. So, again, we get people like Hannah Taylor Muir coming to this area. Would they have been as welcomed had Julia and Harriet not been here first? I don't know. It's a question that I've sought to answer and haven't found. Now, the other two that I want to mention, excuse me, the last one I want to mention is Anna Shaw Chamberlain. Now, she was not a doctor. She was a dentist. I'm sorry, Chamberlain, I'm still not quite sure on the. What is interesting about her, she was born in 1866 in Detroit, and then they moved when she was about 13 to Iowa. What's this about Iowa? I don't know. Uh, but there she met her husband, Frank Chamberlain, or Chamberlain, and he was an 1884 graduate of the University of Iowa Dental Department. And they both arrived here in Colorado Springs in 1887. Now, Dr. Chamberlain, once they moved out here, decided to go to dental school because the University of Denver's dental school opted in 1887 to begin a dental college. And in 1888, once they had a building, they opened their doors, and on April 3rd, 1889, the school graduated its first 4 students: Anna D. Chamberlain, A. Leonard Sanderson, E. W. Varley, and Wilbur E. Wilson. So she was the first female dentist, not only in this region, but the first to graduate from the dental college here in Colorado. Now, there were numerous other women who came through Colorado Springs, Manitou Springs. Some of them have great, interesting stories, and I'm hoping once I get this book printed, the book is out in ebook now, but my publisher was having trouble with printing, so I'm hoping that the print book will be out soon. But I talk about some of the other women who also came through here, and eventually I hope to do one on the women in the Pikes Peak region, which would include the ones in Evergreen, but also the ones that were in Cripple Creek, Victor. The one that I do want to mention, let me find her name very quickly, which I thought was really interesting, Sarah Ellis. And Sarah Ellis, like Minnie Coulter, was one of the few who was licensed by the state of Colorado who did not go to medical college. Although Sarah actually did attend some classes at the Homeopathic Hospital and College in Cleveland. But as far as we can tell, she did not graduate. So when you think about these early women, please remember, try to think back. We didn't have antibiotics. They did not even start understanding, I believe, Lister around the Civil War, found out, about cleanse and cleaning, although it really didn't take until after the war, unfortunately. But we're talking sort of what we would consider primitive medicine. And they were working to alleviate the pain and the suffering. That was their primary goal. Most of them that became doctors wanted to help people ease their suffering. And when you think back to Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman to graduate from a medical college, according to her autobiography, she never had any idea or want to be a doctor. It was only in talking with an older friend who was suffering, and her friend said, "You should go to medical school, because if I'd had a female doctor, I wouldn't be going through what I'm going through now." And I'm paraphrasing it, but she was not even the first. In 1830, Harriet K. Hunt was a medical doctor in Boston, and she became a doctor when her sister was suffering. And she had taken her sister from doctor to doctor and was not getting any relief. And finally, a couple, one of whom one or both was a doctor, were in England, and she started, and they started treatments with her sister with her. And Harriet was so impressed that she started studying under this doctor. And then once they returned to England, she put out her shingle and she continued being a doctor. Many consider her the first female medical doctor in the United States. I haven't verified that, but that's what people say. So you could actually be a doctor if you were very serious by studying with another doctor. But it's these early women back on the East Coast, Dr. Blackwell, Dr. Hunt, Dr. Leonard, Dr. Loomis, that opened the doors for so many to come after. But before I close out, Julia, after graduating, she was not the valedictorian, but she addressed her class, her graduating class. And they were so impressed with what she said that they asked that it be printed in the paper. And I found it. So if you will allow me, I would like to read what she said, because I think it encapsulates what these women were about. Dear friends, I ask your kind indulgence while I occupy a few moments of your time. I should regret to leave this place without saying a few words to this class of ladies with whom I have so long and so pleasantly associated. My dear friends, we came to this college strangers to each other. We left our widely scattered homes surrounding all opposing obstacles with a single purpose in view, our minds all centered on this one great object, that object to prepare ourselves by study for the alleviation of suffering and the elevation of women. And as we have mingled together within these walls day after day and month after month, studiously following the same pursuit, time has endeared you to my heart, and as the period is drawing nigh for separation, and we shall perhaps no more see each other's faces until we meet in the better world, my heart is filled with mingled emotions. While I am filled with joy and greatest delight at the prospect of so soon meeting the dear loved ones at home, a sadness comes over me, a parting sadness. She goes on to list her professors, and now speaking only for myself, I can say that while I sat on the seats before you from day to day a silent listener, I can assure you your instructions have not been in vain to this unworthy student. Know your words have been treasured up in the storehouse of memory for future use. Long having had a desire to acquire a knowledge of the practice of medicine, and the door being opened, I entered this college nearly as ignorant as all leading branches connected with the science, and in one sense like a child, yet with more than a child's desire to learn. But now as I go out among you, may I not hope to go prepared to some extent to at least relieve the suffering of my own sex, and also to bear the responsibility pertaining to our position. Reference having been made to the trifling value of a diploma, allow me to think otherwise. As I go out into this new field of action, I take this role in my hand as I come in contact with opposition, can use it as a shield of defense. It may therefore be considered a token of great value to everyone who shall fill this useful and honorable profession. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for letting me ramble on about my passion. For those of you that would like to know, you can find the book Under the Stone on most e-reader. The only one that has not come on board yet is Amazon. But if you would like to have information when the print book comes out, or if you would like to just ask me questions, put your name and your email address, and I will be glad to let you know, talk with you. I'll let you know when the book is out. And additionally, if you have any questions between now and then, you can contact Chinook Mountain Publishing at gmail.com, and I will get that email and will respond to you. And again, thank you.